let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. For Team Origsburg's first 3 trips to Gulfport, we operated with the understanding that we should do everything as a team. A person had to participate in the fundraisers. They just couldn't pay their share of the cost of the trip. We wanted folks to attend our monthly meetings, participate in our training events, and join in our team worship service before we departed. And the other thing we wanted to do together those first 3 years was travel to and from Gulfport. Now, the first 2 years, that was not too much of a problem. It took 1 15-passenger van the first year and 2 15-passenger vans the second year. Now, the third year got a little more interesting, because at one point leading up to the trip, we had around 48 people registered to go. Putting aside getting everyone's gear down and back, how do we get the people down and back? So the solution we came up with was renting 2 22-passenger vans. And yeah, I know that only adds up to 44, but there was a crane and a box truck and a couple of other things going down separately. So the 2 buses would have handled what we needed. So renting the buses wasn't a problem. There was a rental agency a few miles away from the church that had the buses, and all we needed to do was reserve them. What we were short of people, though, to do was to drive the buses. You see, in order to drive a 22-passenger bus, you need to have a Class B CDL with the correct endorsements. Now, we had 2 people in the team that had them, so we wanted at least 2 more to get them so that we would have enough drivers so people could rest rather than driving the entire time. So 2 of us volunteered to get our Class B CDLs. Now, fortunately, within that group of 48 people were people who knew people at 2 local bus companies. See, in Schuylkill County, most of the public school kids are bused in buses owned by private companies, and the school district contracts that service out. It's not like Pocono Mountain, where the buses are owned by the school district. So we had contacts at 2 of these companies. So I went to one, and the other person went to the other, and they agreed to take us under their wings, teach us how to drive. Now, we had to learn to drive on a full-size school bus, and then use one of their buses to go to the driving center to take the test. Now, I'm pretty sure my first lesson I didn't leave the parking lot, because all it was backing up around the cones and backing up to the line and all the other things you had to do for the portion of the test where you didn't actually leave the exam center. But eventually, I got comfortable and was ready to take the test. So I went online, scheduled the test, and the only available time that fit my schedule was the Saturday before we left. Yeah, no pressure or nothing there. Fortunately, I passed. Now, my colleague, his experience was a little bit different than mine. He was able to start his lessons before I was, so he could schedule a driving test in ample time in case something happened. Now, he made it through the preliminary part of the test at the driving center, no problem. And he and the examiner went out on the road. And they're out a couple of miles when they realize the speedometer is not working. No fully operating vehicle, no test. So even though up to that point everything was fine, because the vehicle was not operating properly, they could not continue the test. The examiner said, I'm not charging you, that you only get so many tries. This doesn't count as a try because it wasn't anything you did, it was the vehicle, but we're going to have to reschedule. So my colleague goes back to his office, contacts the bus company, and quite frankly, I think they were more upset about what happened than he was, and rearranged to take the test again. You see, in a way, my colleague's situation is similar to our relationship with God. With God, we have the opportunity for a second chance. So we just heard Rosalind read a very interesting selection from 1 Kings. Interesting because of how the lectionary folks plucked a few verses from chapter 2 and a few verses from chapter 3 and cobbled them together. But also interesting because what we did not hear, and how if we had heard that, it would have changed our understanding of what was going on in this text. So we start in chapter 2, verses 10 to 20. David slept with his ancestors. You and I would say David died. But back then they said David slept with his ancestors. Now Solomon is on the throne, and the throne has been firmly established for him. Well, if we had read a little bit of chapter 1, we would have heard all the political manipulations that were taking place in order that Solomon got the throne and not the oldest living son of David, Adonijah. So chapter 2 then opens with David giving his charge to Solomon. Be strong and courageous. Walk the ways of God. Keep God's commandments and statutes, and you will prosper. You do all that, God will keep his promise to keep our family on the throne. Well, that was the first half of the charge. The second half of the charge was a list of all the enemies to settle scores with and the people that he needed to take care of because they were his friends while he was king. So after David dies, Solomon eliminates Adonijah and then completes the tasks that David assigned to him, settling the scores and building up the allies, rewarding the allies. David told Solomon to walk in God's ways, to keep God's commandments. What about that commandment that says, do not kill? David also said to obey the ordinances written in the law of Moses. Chapter 3 opens with Solomon making an alliance with the Egyptian Pharaoh and taking his daughter in marriage. So Solomon apparently forgot that instruction about taking a foreign wife. And what was Solomon saying about his trust in God if he makes a political alliance with the Egyptian Pharaoh in order to protect his kingdom? Then we read, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father. Well, most of them anyway. And then the text goes on to say, only he sacrificed and offered incense at high places. So what does only mean? Kind of reminds you of about, 30 years ago when we got an argument over what the definition of is? If you recall, some of you may. Maybe I'm the only one. The Hebrew word for only is R-A-Q, rak, which is also translated as except. So is this a negative? Depends on which commentator you ask. It is questionable because the high places were also used to make offerings to the pagan gods. So some commentators are like, nope, shouldn't have been doing that. Other commentators are like, well, he probably should have been doing it, but the temple wasn't built yet, so it was okay. So it depends on who you ask. So Solomon's at one of these high places, and he makes 1,000 burnt offerings. Now, making all those offerings must have worn him out because he decided to go to sleep. And while he's sleeping, God appears to Solomon in a dream. And God says, ask what I should give you. So let's stop here for a minute. Solomon became king, killed his half-brother and a couple of David's enemies, made a deal with the Egyptian Pharaoh and married his daughter, in violation of the law, and then made sacrifices at the same places where sacrifices were made to pagan gods. And now he's sleeping at one of those places. So what does God do? In spite of everything Solomon has done, God appeared to Solomon in a dream and said, "Ask what I should give you." God came to Solomon. So if Solomon, who killed his half-brother and his father's enemies and violated God's command about foreign marriage, got a second chance, won't we? There's good news here, friends. God is a God of second chances. So do you hear God speaking to you? Do I hear God speaking to me? Is God disregarding whatever we do that's not loving neighbors or welcoming strangers and saying, "Ask what I shall give you"? So last week, we heard the author of Ephesians tell us to be imitators of God. Now this week we hear that even after Solomon kills his brother and his father's enemies and flaunts God's law and does all these other things, God comes to Solomon and says, "Ask what I should give you." So if we are going to be imitators of God, who should we be asking, "Ask what I should give you"? God said, "Ask." And Solomon gave us a lesson in how to pray. Solomon started out with praise and thanksgiving for the kindness God had shown. He admitted to his shortcomings. "I am only a little child. I don't know how to come out or go in." Well, there's a little bit of exaggeration in the first part of that sentence. Solomon, scholars believe, was somewhere around 20 years old when he became king. And then he demonstrated that he knew the difference between selfish wants and God's honoring needs, and asked for the one thing that will bless and honor God. In the NRSV, we read, "Give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can disgovern this great people?" Solomon asks for wisdom. And in doing so, he demonstrated an incredible amount of wisdom. Now be honest now. How many of us at 20 years old would have thought to ask God for wisdom? I think at 20, I pretty much knew everything I needed to know, right? Solomon knew what he needed to govern the people and asked God to provide it to him. So let's talk about wisdom. Solomon said, "Give your servant an understanding," and in the NRSV, the next word was mind. The Hebrew word is leb, L-E-B, meaning inner man, heart, or mind. See, in the Hebrew Bible times, people viewed the heart as we view the mind today. And they gave the heart the functions that we associate with the brain. So Solomon asked for more than intelligence, more than a grasp of facts or an understanding of how life should be lived. Wisdom is more than that. There's a relational component, especially a relationship with God. There is an ethical component. Did you hear Solomon ask for the ability to judge right from wrong? And there's an emotional component, the ability to govern our emotions and desires. With wisdom, we can live in relational harmony, ethical correctness, and emotional control. God was so pleased with Solomon's request that not only did God grant Solomon what he asked for, God also granted Solomon riches and honor all his life. And God also told Solomon that if he straightened up his act, God would lengthen Solomon's life. And it's unfortunate that our reading ended when it did, because if we had kept going a few more verses, we would have heard Solomon woke up, he returned to Jerusalem, and made his offerings at the Ark of the Covenant. Then we would have heard the story of the two women with the baby, where Solomon used the wisdom that God gave him to resolve that dispute. My Team Warwicksburg colleague got a second chance to take the driving portion of the CDL exam. He took advantage of the opportunity and passed the test, giving us enough drivers to get the buses back to and from Gulfport. If we keep reading in 1 Kings, we learn that Solomon regressed. He did not keep God's statutes and commandments. And after his death, the kingdom was divided and ultimately conquered. My prayer for all of us is that God blesses us with wisdom. I pray we receive the wisdom that will guide each of us in the days and months ahead as we strive to become imitators of God. I pray that we live in relational harmony, ethical correctness, and emotional control as we discern the will of God in our lives. And we will please God with how we use our second chances. Amen.